kind of continue our thought on from last week. We talked about temptations, evil temptations, where they come from, why God allows them to exist, and I kind of wanted to think on avoiding temptations. And I think, at least in my observation of people, I've known some great young people who have grown up in the church as Christians who understand the Word of God, and yet they have abandoned their faith for temptations in the world. And in kind of looking, okay, you know, what did the parents do wrong, or what caused them to fall away? I think one of the biggest things that I have found that kind of ties all of these young people together, that challenges them, and I think even challenges us as older people, is our friends. Those we associate with can be our greatest allies or our greatest, perhaps, source of temptation. I know one young man who was a good kid. I had him in teenage Bible class. He could recite scripture. He could do a lesson. He preached from time to time. And yet, because of the friends that he had throughout the week, he became involved in drugs. And the last that I had heard from him, he had OD'd on drugs, nearly killed himself, ended up in rehabilitation. When he got back from rehabilitation, still went back to that. I had a distant cousin that passed away a few weeks ago. Her obituary notice appeared in the paper, and what they did not tell you was that she'd had a drug problem. And as a result of her drug problem, had fled Washington County because there was a warrant for her arrest. When she died, however, she had been arrested in a different part of the state. When she died, she had gone through rehabilitation. But what caused her death was liver and kidney failure due to drug overdoses. And the reason that she gave the family for not coming back to Marietta, to Washington County, was this very thing. She said, I know that my friends are still there. And I know that my friends are still into drugs. And I know if I go back, I will not be able to overcome that temptation. And so I was very thankful to find out that she died in a free state. But let's consider for a moment, as human beings, God created us as social creatures. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 18, the Bible tells us that when God looked at man, he said, it is not good for man to be alone. And so he created a woman, called her Eve, gave her to Adam, that there might be a companionship. Now, maybe you're single, maybe you're married, but nevertheless, we all are still social creatures. And there's been studies, I looked at some studies on the need that humans have for social environments. And one of those was studying inmates in prison. And what they discovered was people who are in solitary confinement, their greatest strain in being in solitary confinement is the lack of socialization with other people. One inmate talked about how he had became personally attached to a spider in his cell. Now, that doesn't sound like a relationship that I want to have, but I suppose if a spider is the only thing that you have to talk to, that spider becomes quite important to you. Now, you know, so we see and we recognize this. If we remove ourselves from society, oftentimes we do find ourselves socializing with animals on a greater level than what we normally would. And And so we see the need for friends, for fellow human beings. And to separate ourselves from other human beings has never been God's plan or design for us. God intended us. In fact, you can read the Old Testament in the book of Proverbs. Solomon talks to his son about having friends and choosing them carefully. But it is never mentioned that a man should withdraw himself from other human beings on a complete level. God has even set up our worship to be with others. You ever think about that? We never see a pattern in the New Testament scriptures of anyone worshiping by themselves. When Jesus sent out his disciples, he sent them out 2 by 2. When the Apostle Paul went on missionary trips, there was always a group of people with him on those missionary trips. In Matthew chapter 18, Jesus talks about prayer and the necessity of prayer as far as it relates to what we do as a collective group. Matthew chapter 18, verse 26, Jesus says, I think this is right. It says, this is the wrong passage, I'm sorry. If we look at Hebrews chapter, I'll bet it's Matthew chapter 8. I bet we've got a 1 stuck in here. Matthew chapter 8 is not it either. I'll find it later. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 25 talks about not forsaking the assembly of yourselves together as the manner of some is. But the Hebrew writer says the more so as you see the day approaching. And so we see our worship is of necessity to have others around us to worship God. Even right down to a communion is an example of the worship that is to be done together. If you'll turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and I want to focus on verse 20, where the Apostle Paul says, when you come together, therefore into one place. So there's a coming together of individuals, a coming together of Christians. He says, when you come together, the purpose of this coming together, he says, into one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. It's not to eat a common meal, and he goes into the communion. But there is an assembly together. He says down here in verse 23, as I have received of the Lord, that which also I deliver unto you. And so he goes into the process of the communion service. But we see a pattern of New Testament Christians building together. Solomon in the book of Proverbs says, iron sharpeneth iron, when he's talking about two people studying together, making each other better believers. So consider your friends carefully. Never think that your friends have no sway over the decisions you make. You know, one person I was thinking about one time used the analogy of apples. A bad apple will spoil the entire box. You know, my dad taught me that too. We had a spring house growing up, and Dad would get several bushels of apples in the fall and winter, and potatoes as well. We had one corner that had a wooden bin in it for potatoes, and he would send us kids down there, and we would sort through the apple bin and the potato bin, and we would pull anything out that had a spot in it that was beginning to spoil, because if it touched those around it, then they would begin to spoil as well, and we'd be out of apples before we wanted to be, and certainly out of potatoes before spring. It doesn't take long when potatoes start to go bad. Dad would always buy 2,000 pounds of potatoes every fall. And well, I guess we ate all of them, because there was very little to be cleaned out of the bin come planting time in the spring. But Dad always figured to have that 2,000 pounds of potatoes. But if we didn't clean them out, clean out the bad ones, we would have a mess. And if you've ever smelled a rotten potato, there's few things ever worse than rotten potatoes. Our friends are like that. We get a friend that has an evil influence over us, it can ruin our entire lives. And so we need to choose our friends carefully. Making friends with ungodly people can be a dangerous thing. I want us to look at what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, down at verse 33. Paul says here in verse 33, he says, "Be not deceived. Evil communications corrupt good manners." Your English Standard Version will word that slightly differently. But basically what Paul is saying here in verse 33 is, when we're around evil people, they corrupt us and they drag us down. And this is not saying that we can be completely out, away from people, but he's talking about our close friends. He says in verse 34, "Awake to righteousness and sin not, for some have not the knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame." Now, speaking that to our shame our shame should be that we should always make sure that our friends know that we are Christians. You know, it's better to look at our friends before we build that relationship. And kind of mentally ask ourselves, is this the kind of person that I want to be friends with? That's what Solomon is encouraging his son to do in the book of Proverbs, chapter 22. It's important, particularly for young people, that we choose our friends carefully. The wrong friends can lead us down the path of sin that we don't want to go. Path of alcohol, drugs, tobacco. We could go on and on with a list of things that are caused primarily in teenagers by peer pressure. Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 24, Solomon says, "Make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man thou shalt not go, lest thou learn his ways, and get a snare to thy soul." Solomon wants us to understand, and he wanted his son to understand as he was writing this, the danger of a person who has a temper. The danger of being friends with that man is that his son would learn from his example. And so Solomon is cautioning his son, be careful who your friends are. We can take that as well. Be careful who we make as our close acquaintances. Now, every person who lives a life of sin, I think we can say this safely. Every person who lives a life of sin has followed temptations passed on to them by their environment. In other words, those around them are pretty much responsible for their temptations. I'll make a case in point from pictures here. We got a case study. Prince Amnon, son of David. David, we know, was a man after God's own heart. So let's go back here to 2 Samuel. And in 2 Samuel chapter 13, and I'm actually going to read this from the English Standard Version. I think that it reads better, more understandable than the King James. 2 Samuel chapter 13. We realize that David was a man after God's own heart, but David also had some issues. Here David has two sons that are mentioned in this passage. Chapter 13 and verse 1. Now Absalom, David's son, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar. And after a time, Amnon, David's son, these are half-brother and half-sisters. Same father, different mothers. one of David's weaknesses. We'll talk about that another time. So he says, after a time, David's son loved her. Now this word loved in the Hebrew is not the love that we think of. This is a sexual lust, is what this is wanting us to understand. And Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. You don't think you'd read a story like this from the Word of God, do you? It's pretty horrible story. Verse 3, though, notice this is important to our case in point. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimeon, David's brother. So he's a cousin of Ammon's. And Jonadab was a very crafty man. And he said to him, O son of the king. He's reminding him here, you are the son of the king. He says, why are you so haggard, morning after morning? Will you not tell me? And Amnon said to him, I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. And Jonadab said unto him, and he gives him instructions. I'll leave that for you to read on your own time. He gives him instructions on how to go about to take advantage of his sister, half-sister. But you know, the story doesn't stop there. If you'll drop down to verse 9, we see more picked up here. In verse 9, he followed through with his brother's, or with his cousin's instructions, his friend's instructions. And then, sadly enough, if we drop down to verse 20, we find Amnon. It says, this about Tamar. It says, and her brother Absalom said to her, has Amnon your brother been with you? Now hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this to heart. So Tamar lived a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house. What a sad end to this story, but it really doesn't end there. We can pick up the account again down in verse 29. We see Amnon's end. We see his swift punishment from God. In verse 29 it says, so the servant of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the sons arose and mounted his mule and fled. Amnon was killed by his half-brother's servant in revenge of what he had done to Tamar. Bottom line of this, in all likelihood, had he chosen his friends more carefully, he would not have given in to temptation. Bottom line, Amnon gave in to someone with a wicked mind. At the end of this account, only Amnon dies. But his friend will also stand before God in judgment for the evil influence that he had on Prince Amnon. I say, if you have time, read that entire chapter and read the entire account. I would do so here, but I don't want to do so for the kids' sake. But let's just say it's a case study. Cause and effect. Lifestyle choices have harsh ends. It sounds bad, it sounds cruel, it sounds heartless. But chances are, if a person does drugs, they're going to end up overdosing at some point in their life. Chances are, if a person is into fornication as a lifestyle, or adultery. In today's society, chances are you're going to end up with AIDS or some form of STDs. Lifestyle choices have harsh ends. And ultimately, the harshest end that any of us will face is judgment. So choose your friends carefully. You know, as I said, only Amnon met a harsh end that day when he was killed. But Jonadab will someday also stand before God. You know, I found a quote that I think is very appropriate. And I think it fits this lesson quite well. No bad person can be a good friend. It just doesn't work. No bad person is ever going to be a good friend to you. We may be in the world. We might be part of this world. We may live with people surrounding us who are in these conditions. And we as Christians have an obligation to try to help them. But we need to realize that helping a person and becoming a person's great friend needs to be taken very seriously. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul cautions the Corinthians that they are in the world, but they don't need to be a part of the world that they are living in. They don't need to take part in the sinful nature of the world. Paul says this, he says, 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10, "Yet not altogether, for the fornicators of this world, nor the covetous, nor extortioners, nor of the idolaters, for then you must needs go out of the world. But now have I written you not to keep company, if any man that is called a brother be a fornicator, or covetousness, or idolater, nor a railer, nor a drunkard, nor an extortioner. With such a one, know not to eat." So he's saying, draw a line. You're in the world, you can't avoid them altogether, but draw a line and recognize there is a point of fellowship with someone who is called a brother, that you cannot eat with one that is such a person. There's a point that we have to draw the line. Our strongest relationships should be with those who are Christians. Our strongest relationships should be with members of the church. People who we have a common goal of making heaven our home for eternity. That should be our strongest relationships. You know, it saddens me sometimes. I've been places where folks don't know each other. And in congregations where folks don't spend time outside of worship with each other. Sometimes we don't even know where other people live at. The Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and in verse 14 through 18 says this. He says, "Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communication hath light with darkness? And what concord has Christ with Baal? Baal's an idol. Or what hath he that believeth with an infidel? And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple. Christians are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty." So Paul is instructing us to remember that we are separate from the world. You know, the Apostle Paul, through the book of Acts to his last epistle, in the New Testament scriptures, the Apostle Paul individually names over 100 men and women as part of his circle of friends, if you will. Some of them are named as fellow laborers of the gospel. But nevertheless, for Paul to name individuals, over 100 in number, meant that Paul had a circle of good, godly friends. And we should as well. We should have good, godly friends that are seeking the same as we are, who are seeking to serve God, to live righteous lives, to be acceptable of God. In Romans chapter 12 and verse 10, the Apostle Paul says this towards Christians: be kindly affectionate one to another with brotherly love, in honor, preferring one another. This should be our preference to each other. Finally, when faced with temptations, when maybe our friends or even perhaps our fellow Christians are tempting us to go down the wrong path, Paul says, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. Remember, it is God's strength in which we stand. When we're tempted to give in to peer pressure, when we're tempted to cave to the influence surrounding us, whether it's on a large scale, whether it's a small scale, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. If you will, go ahead and take out a songbook and we'll sing an invitation song. I'll be a friend to Jesus. I love this song because it talks about us having that relationship with Christ, being